Right now, somewhere on the western edge of Europe, a river is moving toward the sea. The Tagus is wide here, wider than most people expect the first time they see it, wide enough that on a hazy morning the far bank disappears entirely, and the water ahead looks less like a river and more like the beginning of something much larger. The Atlantic is 20 miles beyond the river's mouth. On a clear day you feel it in the wind before you see it. The salt in the air, the particular cold that comes off open ocean even in summer. Every civilization that ever came to this hill understood the same thing before they placed the first stone. This is the last harbour before the open sea, the last city before the edge. For most of human history, that made it feel like the end of the world. Then, in the space of one extraordinary century, it became the centre of it. Few cities of Lisbon's size have ever done what this city did, from these 7 hills, above this river. A small kingdom launched the ships that opened the first continuous sea route from Europe to Asia, that connected 4 continents in a single commercial system for the first time in recorded history, and that changed the way European maps represented the world permanently and completely. Rome did not do it. Venice did not do it. London did not do it. Lisbon did. This is the story of how that happened, what it cost, who paid that cost, and what remains. We are going back to the beginning, to a hill, a river, and a people that history almost forgot to write about. As always, we will see you in the past. Chapter 1. Olisipo, the city before its name. Imagine you are standing on a hill above a wide river, sometime around 1200 years before the birth of Christ. The hill is steep. From where you stand, you can see the river below curving south toward an opening in the land. And beyond that, opening the light on the water changes in a way that tells you the sea is close, even if you cannot yet see it. The air carries salt. The wind comes off the water cold even in summer. Behind you is the interior of the peninsula. Dry hills and thin forest stretching east toward distances you have never travelled. In front of you is everything else. You are not standing here by accident, and neither was anyone who stood here before you. The place you are standing has a quality almost impossible to replicate anywhere else on the Atlantic coast of Europe. The river below is not just a river. It is the longest navigable estuary on this entire coastline, wide and deep enough that large ships can travel many miles inland from the ocean before the water becomes too shallow to continue. The hill gives whoever holds it a clear view of everything moving on that water in either direction, and the ocean at the river's mouth connects, in principle, to every coastline on Earth. That combination does not exist anywhere else in Europe in the same form. Deep estuary, defensible high ground, direct Atlantic access. The people who first settled here may not have had words for strategic geography, but they understood it the way anyone understands an advantage that keeps proving itself across generations. You hold this ground. You do not give it up. The earliest evidence of human settlement on the hill above the Tagus dates to at least the late Bronze Age, roughly 1200 to 800 years before the birth of Christ. Based on ceramic fragments and material remains recovered by archaeologists working beneath the oldest sections of the modern city, particularly the area of the hill now occupied by the castle. These were not the first people to notice the location. They were simply the first whose physical traces have survived long enough for us to find. By the first millennium before the Common Era, the location had attracted the attention of the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians were the most consequential maritime traders of the ancient Mediterranean world, based in cities along what is now the Lebanese coast. They built a commercial network that by the 8th and 7th centuries before the Common Era extended from the eastern Mediterranean all the way to the Atlantic shores of the Iberian Peninsula and deep into North Africa. They were not conquerors. They were merchants. What they wanted from a new location was not submission. They wanted a harbour, fresh water, a population willing to trade, and the ability to keep moving. The site above the Tagus offered everything on that list. The Phoenicians gave the settlement a name. Scholars have debated its precise etymology for generations without reaching a definitive conclusion, but the most widely discussed proposals connect it to roots, meaning something close to calm, harbour, or safe anchorage, which would have been an accurate description and a commercially useful one. What is clearer than the name is the reason for the presence. The Tagus Valley and the regions accessible through it were rich in silver, tin, and copper from the mines of the Iberian interior, Atlantic fish in extraordinary abundance, grain from the river valleys further inland. These were goods for which there was consistent demand across the Mediterranean world, and the Tagus estuary was one of the most efficient places in Western Europe to collect and ship them. Think about what that trade network meant in practice. A Phoenician merchant sitting above this river in the 7th century before the Common Era had commercial connections stretching east across the entire Mediterranean to the cities of the Levant, south along the Atlantic coast of Africa, and possibly, according to ancient accounts that scholars continue to evaluate carefully, as far as the tin-producing regions of what is now Britain. The idea that this location was remote or peripheral is a later invention. For the people who understood Atlantic trade routes, it was a hub. The Carthaginians, themselves of Phoenician origin and the dominant commercial power of the Western Mediterranean after the decline of the original Phoenician city-states, continued and extended the trading presence on the Tagus. Material evidence. Pottery and artifacts of Carthaginian origin found at sites in and around modern Lisbon places the city within the orbit of the most sophisticated commercial civilization of its era. Then, sometime around 205 years before the birth of Christ, Rome arrived. The Roman arrival on the Iberian Peninsula was not initially about this location. It was about Carthage. The Second Punic War had made the Iberian Peninsula a theatre of strategic competition between the two greatest powers of the Western Mediterranean. When Rome began to win that competition decisively, its legions moved westward across the peninsula, building roads, establishing administrative structures, converting conquest into permanent control. The settlement above the Tagus, which Roman administrators would record as Olisipo, was absorbed into Roman authority sometime around 205 years before the Common Era. What matters is what the Romans recognized when they arrived. They recognized exactly what the Phoenicians and the Carthaginians had recognized before them. This was too valuable a location to leave undeveloped. Under Roman administration, Olisipo was formally incorporated into the province of Lusitania and granted the status of a municipium, meaning its inhabitants received significant rights under Roman law, including for some a form of Roman citizenship. This was not a designation given to every settlement Rome absorbed. It reflected a deliberate judgment about commercial and strategic importance. The Romans built what Romans always built when they decided a place mattered: roads, a forum, public baths, a theatre whose remains were discovered by archaeologists in the 20th century beneath the streets of the modern Alfama district and can still be visited today. They organized and extended the harbour facilities along the riverbank below the hill. The most commercially significant of those activities was the production of garum. Garum was a fermented fish sauce produced from the abundant Atlantic species caught in the waters off the Iberian coast. It was to the Roman world roughly what a premium luxury condiment is to a modern food market, demanded across the empire, shipped in distinctive ceramic amphorae that archaeologists have recovered at Roman sites from Britain to the Black Sea. The scale of production along the Tagus and the wider Portuguese coast was, by the standards of the ancient world, genuinely industrial. A tombstone found in the area of the modern city records a man from Alexandria in Egypt who lived and died in Olisipo. He is one of dozens documented by inscription and artifact whose origins span the width of the Roman world, from North Africa, from the eastern Mediterranean, from Gaul, from the Iberian interior. From its earliest Roman phase, this city was already a place of arrivals, a place where people came from somewhere else and built something. That pattern was established before the birth of Christ. It has not fundamentally changed since. But before we go further into what Rome built here, we need to stop and talk about the man who made Rome work harder for this territory than Rome had expected to work for almost anywhere. His name was Viriatus. Viriatus was a leader of the Lusitani, the Celtic Iberian people who inhabited the western regions of the Iberian Peninsula, and he organized and sustained a military resistance against Roman expansion that lasted, by most historical accounts, from roughly 147 years before the Common Era to 139 years before the Common Era. 8 years, against the most effective military machine the ancient world had produced. The historical sources for Viriatus come primarily from later Roman and Greek writers, which means they carry the biases those origins imply. And modern historians are appropriately cautious about specific details, but the broad outline is consistent. He was a man of the mountains and the upland forests of western Iberia, likely a shepherd or hunter before he became a commander, who understood the terrain of the peninsula with an intimacy that Roman legions could not match. He used that understanding to conduct a style of warfare the Romans found genuinely difficult to counter: mobility over massed engagement, deception over direct confrontation, the land itself as a weapon. There is one detail in the surviving accounts that stays with you. After one of his victories against a Roman force significantly larger than his own, Viriatus reportedly divided the spoils among his men before they had finished counting them, then broke camp and moved before the Romans could reorganize. The Roman commanders who received reports of that speed found it difficult to believe. Their army moved with supply wagons and structured formations. Viriatus moved like the hills he had grown up in. Multiple Roman commanders failed against him. Treaties were negotiated and on at least one occasion rejected by the Roman Senate when the terms proved unfavorable. A breach of good faith that damaged Roman credibility with the Iberian populations for years. Rome eventually found a way through that was not military victory. In 139 years before the Common Era, Viriatus was killed in his sleep by men from within his own circle who had been approached by Roman agents. The Romans reportedly refused to pay them, on the grounds that Rome did not reward the killers of leaders. Whether that reflects genuine principle or retrospective reputation management, the sources do not resolve. What Viriatus left behind was something the written record cannot fully quantify. He had demonstrated that the people of this western corner of the peninsula were willing to hold a position past the point where holding it seemed rational, to resist a larger force past the point where resistance seemed survivable. The Portuguese would recognize that quality in themselves again, at intervals separated by centuries, in circumstances that had nothing to do with Rome. With the resistance broken, Olisipo developed through the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era into a prosperous and cosmopolitan provincial city. Then the empire that had built all of it began to fail. The collapse of Roman authority in the Western Empire was not a single event but a long deterioration, spanning the 3rd and 4th centuries and accelerating through the 5th. The hill above the Tagus did not empty. People continued to live here, because the river and the estuary and the ocean access that had made the location valuable had not changed. Geography does not collapse when empires do, but the city that would emerge from what came next would look almost nothing like the Roman municipium that had exported garum to Britain and North Africa. A new power was coming, from the south, across the water, with a different language, a different faith, and a vision of what a city on the Atlantic edge of the world could be that the Romans had never imagined. Under that new power, the settlement above the Tagus would become, by the standards of the early medieval world, genuinely great. Chapter 2. The Moors and the City that Faced the Sea. In the spring of 711, a military force crossed the narrow strait at the southern tip of the Iberian Peninsula from North Africa. The force was substantial. The commander was a Berber general named Tariq ibn Ziyad, acting under the authority of the Umayyad Caliphate, the Arab Islamic Empire that in roughly 80 years had expanded from its origins in the Arabian Peninsula to control territory stretching from Central Asia to the Atlantic coast of North Africa. The Visigoth kingdom that had governed Iberia for 2 centuries was not in the condition required to stop what was coming. A disputed succession had divided the Visigoth military class at precisely the wrong moment. The king, Roderick, faced challenges to his own legitimacy from within his own aristocracy. He met the invading force at a battle near the Guadalquivir River in July of 711. He was defeated and most likely killed. The Visigoth kingdom, without effective central leadership, collapsed with a speed that surprised even the men who had caused the collapse. Within roughly 7 years, Muslim forces controlled the vast majority of the Iberian Peninsula. The settlement above the Tagus fell to Arab forces sometime in the 700-teens. It passed into the administration of the new rulers, and those rulers did what every previous power had done when they arrived at this location. They looked at the hill and the river, and the estuary opening to the sea. They called it Al-Ushbuna, and they recognized the value immediately. Here is the part of this story that is almost never told fully in popular accounts of medieval Iberia. Under Islamic administration, Al-Ushbuna became something the Visigoths had not had the resources or the commercial connections to attempt. It became a genuinely prosperous medieval city, connected to one of the most intellectually and commercially sophisticated civilizations of the early medieval world, at a time when most of Western Europe was organized around subsistence, agriculture, and local trade. The Umayyad administration that governed Iberia from its capital at Cordoba was connected through trade and intellectual exchange to a world extending from Spain to Baghdad to Central Asia and across North Africa and into East Africa. That connectivity had practical consequences for every city it touched. Agricultural techniques developed in the more arid environments of the Middle East and North Africa, including sophisticated irrigation systems and the cultivation of citrus, rice, and sugar, were introduced to the Iberian Peninsula and transformed its agricultural productivity across the 8th through 10th centuries. The fields above the Tagus Valley that still produce the wine and olive oil and citrus that are part of Portuguese agricultural identity today were shaped, in significant part, by knowledge introduced during this period. There is a detail in the archaeological record that makes this connectivity tangible. Researchers excavating sites in and around the Alfama district over many decades have found, within the material layers of the Moorish period, fragments of glassware whose chemical composition indicates origin in workshops in Syria and Egypt, amber beads whose Baltic source was established through isotopic analysis, and pottery with decorative styles connected to workshops in North Africa. These objects did not arrive in Al-Ushbuna by accident. They arrived because someone had the commercial relationships and the transport infrastructure to move them across thousands of miles. Al-Ushbuna in the 9th and 10th centuries was not a regional backwater. It was a node in a network that connected the Atlantic edge of the world to its centre. The physical shape of the city changed substantially under Moorish administration. The Alcacova, the fortified citadel built on the highest point of the hill above the river, was constructed or substantially rebuilt in this period. The street pattern that developed in what is now the Alfama district, the narrow lanes and irregular blocks that visitors find charming today, reflects the medieval Islamic urban form that evolved across these centuries. The word Alfama itself derives from the Arabic al-Hama, meaning the baths. It is a reminder written permanently into the city's geography of who built what and when. The population of Al-Ushbuna during the Moorish centuries was religiously and ethnically mixed in ways that simplified narratives tend to flatten. The Mosarabs, Christians who continued to practice their faith under Islamic rule and who retained certain legal rights under Umayyad administrative frameworks, remained a significant presence. The Jewish community, which had faced increasing legal restrictions under the later Visigoth kings, found conditions under Islamic administration generally, though not uniformly, more accommodating. Muslim settlers from North Africa and the Arab world lived alongside these existing communities in a city that was, by the standards of 9th and 10th century Europe, unusually cosmopolitan. None of this means the period was without conflict or coercion. It was not. The relationship between the Muslim administration and the non-Muslim communities it governed was asymmetrical in legal terms, and sometimes in practice. The Almoravid and Almohad dynasties from North Africa that took control of Islamic Iberia in the 11th and 12th centuries imposed considerably stricter religious policies than the earlier Umayyad administration had maintained. These complications belong in the account. By the 11th century, the political situation across Iberia was changing in ways that would eventually reach Al-Ushbuna. The Umayyad Caliphate of Cordoba had fragmented into a collection of smaller successor states, the Taifa kingdoms, weakening the military capacity of Islamic Iberia at precisely the moment when the Christian kingdoms of the north were consolidating their strength and pushing south with increasing effectiveness. For Al-Ushbuna, the shift would arrive in the summer of 1147, in the form of an army from the north, a fleet of crusaders from the Atlantic, and a siege that would end 3.5 centuries of Moorish rule and begin the story of a city with a new name, a new faith, and an ambition that not even the people who held it could yet imagine. Chapter 3. Reconquista and the Kingdom that Chose this Hill. In the summer of 1147, a fleet of ships appeared off the Portuguese coast heading south. They had not planned to stop. The men aboard were crusaders from England and Flanders and the German territories, on their way to the Holy Land as part of the Second Crusade. They had put in at Porto on the northern coast of Portugal to resupply and wait out the Atlantic weather that the Bay of Biscay had given them on the way down. They were behind schedule. They had a destination, and then they met a king who had a different use for them in mind. Afonso Henriques had spent most of his adult life fighting for a title that did not yet officially exist. He had been asserting by force of arms and political pressure the claim that the territory he controlled was not a vassal state of the larger kingdoms around it, but an independent kingdom in its own right. The Pope had not yet recognized that claim. The King of Leon and Castile regarded him as a subordinate who had considerably overstepped. What he needed was a military victory substantial enough to force everyone around him to take his independent kingdom seriously. He approached the Crusader commanders with a proposition. "Help me take the city at the mouth of the Tagus." he told them, and you will have what you came for. The right to plunder the city when it falls. Land for those who want it. Wealth accumulated over 3.5 centuries of Moorish commercial life. The Crusaders were not supposed to stop, but they had been at sea for a long time. They agreed. What followed was a siege that lasted from July to October of 1147. 17 weeks against walls that centuries of occupation had made formidable. The sources for this event are unusually rich by 12th century standards. An English participant, whose letter describing the siege historians call the De Expugnatione Lisbonense, left a first-hand account that includes tactical details, moments of negotiation between the besiegers and the besieged, and observations about the city and its defenders that no other source preserves. In that account, there is one moment that stays in the memory long after the tactical details fade. Partway through the siege, the Moorish commander of the garrison sent a messenger to the Crusader camp with a request not for surrender, but for conversation. The messenger, an elderly man by the description in the English Chronicle, was escorted into the camp and sat across from the Crusader commanders. He did not ask them to withdraw. He asked them, in terms the Chronicle records with surprising specificity, what they believed they were fighting for, whether the God they invoked for their cause would recognize what they were doing in his name. The Crusader commanders had no answer that satisfied anyone present, including apparently themselves. The messenger returned to the walls. The siege continued. In October of 1147, the garrison negotiated a surrender. The negotiated terms did not survive contact with the moment of victory. The English account describes a breakdown in discipline among the Crusader forces as the city opened, looting that exceeded what the agreement had authorized, and violence that the Chronicle records with unease. The Mozarab bishop of the city, the Christian bishop who had administered to the Christian community under Moorish rule, was reportedly killed in the disorder, not by the departing Moorish garrison, by Crusaders. These details are in the historical record because a participant who had no obvious motive to invent them wrote them down. They belong in this account because they are part of what actually happened. Afonso Henriquez had his city. He moved quickly. A bishop was installed. The main mosque was converted to a cathedral. The Alcacova on the hilltop was garrisoned and became what is now known as the Castle of São Jorge. The administrative work of incorporating the city into a kingdom still fighting for its right to exist began immediately. 32 years later, in 1179, Pope Alexander III formally recognized Afonso Henriques as King of Portugal. The letter of recognition is one of the founding documents of the Portuguese state. Afonso was in his 60s by then. He had spent nearly his entire life in the military and political struggle that the letter represented. He died in 1185. The city he had taken was not yet the capital of the kingdom he had built. That step came under his great-grandson. In 1255, Afonso III formally moved the capital of Portugal from Coimbra to Lisbon. The reasoning was practical and visionary simultaneously. Lisbon sat at the center of a kingdom whose southern boundaries had now been extended to approximately the borders of modern Portugal. It controlled the Tagus estuary, one of the finest natural harbours on the Atlantic coast of Europe. A kingdom that intended to be a serious maritime and commercial power needed its capital where its ships could operate. Afonso III understood something in 1255 that would not be fully demonstrated for another 2 centuries. He understood that this city, on this river, facing this ocean, was the right place to anchor a kingdom with ambitions larger than its size suggested it should be allowed to have. He could not have known how profoundly right he was. Chapter 4. Prince Henry and the System That Changed Everything. There is a temptation, when the story of the Portuguese age of exploration begins, to start with the ships, the caravels, those narrow-hulled vessels with their triangular latine sails that could work against the wind in ways the square-rigged ships of northern Europe could not. The instruments, the charts, the harbour at Lisbon filling with provisions, and the particular organised energy of a major voyage preparing to depart. They are compelling images, and they came second. What came first was a decision made not on a dock but in a royal court, by a prince who would spend his entire life organising voyages he almost never personally took. His name was Enrique, Duke of Viseu. History knows him as Prince Henry the Navigator, a title attached by later centuries, that is, in a specific and important sense, misleading. Henry did not navigate. He did not personally stand at a helm and steer into uncharted water. What he did was something rarer and in many ways more consequential than any individual voyage. He built a system. Henry was the third son of King João I of Portugal and his English wife Philippa of Lancaster, herself the daughter of John of Gaunt, which made Henry a grandson of Edward III of England. He was born in 1394. He was present as a young man at the Portuguese conquest of Ceuta in 1415, the campaign that seized a major Moorish commercial city on the North African coast and gave Portugal its first foothold outside the Iberian Peninsula. Ceuta changed the way Henry understood what Portugal could become. The city of Ceuta was a node in the trans-Saharan trade network, the system of caravan routes that moved gold, ivory, and enslaved people north across the Sahara to the Mediterranean coast. The Portuguese who captured it found warehouses full of goods that had travelled thousands of miles across terrain they had never seen, from places they could not locate on any map they possessed. The merchants of Ceuta knew where those goods came from. They were not sharing that knowledge with the new occupiers. Henry understood the implication immediately. The wealth of sub-Saharan Africa was real. The routes connecting it to the Mediterranean were controlled entirely by intermediaries who had every commercial incentive to keep the sources of that wealth inaccessible to European competitors. If Portugal could find a sea route down the Atlantic coast of Africa that bypassed the Saharan caravan routes entirely, the commercial consequences would be transformative. He spent the next 4 decades trying to find it. Here is what he did not build. He did not build a school, the legend of a formal school of Sagres, a kind of medieval university of navigation established by Henry at the southwestern tip of Portugal, has been repeated in popular history for centuries and has been significantly questioned by modern scholarship. The evidence for a formal, institutionally organized school at Sagres is thin. What later centuries romanticized as a school was probably, in practice, something less tidy and more effective. What Henry built was a patronage network. He sponsored voyages, consistently, year after year, decade after decade. He provided the organizational and financial backing that allowed sailors to attempt routes without having to finance the entire enterprise themselves, which meant that failure on one voyage did not end the entire project. He gathered around him people with knowledge useful to oceanic navigation, cartographers and astronomers and pilots from various parts of the Mediterranean and European world, including Jewish scholars whose mathematical and astronomical expertise was among the best available anywhere in the mid-15th century. He commissioned and collected maps. He accumulated the geographical knowledge that each returning voyage brought back and used it to plan the next one. There was a pilot named Afonso Goncalves Baldaya, who returned from a voyage in 1435, having travelled further south along the African coast than any previous Portuguese captain. reaching a latitude that established a new southern limit for the known coastline. His report went into the accumulated record. The next voyage started from where he had stopped. That is how the system worked, not through individual genius, but through organized, funded, persist accumulation. Each captain standing on the shoulders of every captain who had gone before, because someone in Lisbon was keeping the records, funding the departures, and waiting for the ships to come back. Cape Bojador, the headland on the West African coast that had represented both a navigational difficulty and a psychological barrier for Atlantic sailors, was finally rounded by a Portuguese captain named Gil Eanes in 1434. The currents and shallows in its vicinity were real obstacles. The fearful stories accumulated around it, of waters that boiled, of ships that could not return, were not real. Gil Eanes came back, and after he came back, the coast beyond Bojador was no longer a rumour. It was a place. It is important to say clearly what else those voyages included. The Portuguese exploration of the West African coast was, from its earliest stages, connected to the slave trade. The first enslaved Africans brought to Portugal arrived in 1441, a fact that sits in the historical record with full weight. The Portuguese did not invent slavery, which had been practiced across human civilizations for millennia and which the trans-Saharan routes had carried for centuries before any Portuguese ship reached West Africa. But the Portuguese initiated the Atlantic slave trade. The system of forced transportation of enslaved Africans across the ocean that would, over the following 4 centuries, move an estimated 12 million human beings in conditions of systematic brutality, and that shaped the demographics, the economics, and the politics of the Atlantic world in ways whose consequences are not historical past but living present. This is part of the story of Lisbon, not a footnote, a central fact, inseparable from the commercial logic that drove the exploration and from the wealth that flowed back into the city as a result. Henry died in 1460 without knowing how far south the African continent extended or whether a sea route to Asia existed around it. What he left behind was not a completed project. What he left behind was momentum. In 1488, a captain named Bartolomeu Dias rounded the southern tip of Africa, becoming the first European commander on record to do so, proving that the continent had an end and that the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean were connected by open water. When he returned to Lisbon with that news, a Genoese navigator named Cristóvão Colombo, who had been living in Portugal and who was preparing his own proposal for reaching Asia, by sailing west across the Atlantic, heard Dias's report and understood immediately what it meant. He left for Spain shortly afterward. The connection between what Henry built, what Dias proved, and what Columbus then attempted is the chain of consequence that links 40 years of organized Portuguese investment to the events that most Americans are taught to treat as the origin point of everything that followed. Portugal had proven the route existed. The question was whether anyone could complete it. Chapter 5. Vasco da Gama and the Voyage that Rewrote the World. On the 8th of July, 1497, 4 ships left the Tagus estuary and turned south. There was a woman standing on the dock at Belém who watched them go. Her name is not in any record that survives, but the chronicle of the voyage, written by a participant and preserved in the Portuguese National Archives, notes that families gathered at the waterfront that morning, and that among the sounds of the departure, the creak of timber and the snap of canvas and the shouted commands of the pilots, there was also weeping, not from the sailors, from the people watching the sailors go. She understood, without anyone needing to explain it. that a voyage into waters no European fleet had navigated might not produce a return. The fleet consisted of 4 vessels: the flagship São Gabriel, the São Rafael, commanded by Vasco da Gama's brother Paulo, a smaller caravel named the Berrio, and a supply ship. The total crew numbered somewhere between 150 and 170 men, according to different sources, a figure historians treat with appropriate uncertainty. They carried trade goods intended as gifts and commercial samples. They carried letters of introduction from King Manuel I written in Arabic and other languages, anticipating contact with Muslim rulers and merchants along the route. Vasco da Gama himself was in his late 20s or early 30s, depending on which of the conflicting records of his birth date is accepted. He was not the first choice for the command. His father Estevão da Gama had apparently been selected before his death made that impossible. Vasco was appointed in his father's place. The sources do not tell us whether he understood, standing on the deck of the São Gabriel in July of 1497, that he was about to make the most consequential voyage in the history of European navigation. They carried the accumulated knowledge of everything Henry's system had produced. The charts of the African coast down to the Cape of Good Hope, the navigational techniques, including the use of astronomical observation to determine latitude, that Portuguese pilots had been developing across multiple generations of Atlantic voyaging, and crucially, the understanding derived from Dias's experience of the wind patterns in the South Atlantic, that the most efficient route south to the Cape required sailing far out into the open ocean rather than following the African coastline. That decision sounds technical. Its human meaning was this: for weeks after leaving the Cape Verde Islands, the fleet would sail southwest into open water with no land in sight, no coastal landmark to confirm position, no possibility of putting in for repairs or supplies, the ocean in every direction, the crew trusting that the mathematics worked and that they would eventually find the winds that would curve them back toward Africa and the Cape. They rounded the Cape of Good Hope in November of 1497. Roughly 4 months after leaving Lisbon, they entered the Indian Ocean. What they found on the other side was not empty water waiting to be discovered. The Indian Ocean in 1497 was one of the most commercially active bodies of water in the world. Arab merchants had been sailing it for centuries, following the monsoon winds between East Africa, the Persian Gulf, India, and Southeast Asia in a system of extraordinary sophistication. The Swahili city-states of the East African coast were genuine commercial centres with stone architecture and long-distance trading connections. Indian traders from the Malabar coast had built networks moving spices, textile, and precious goods across thousands of miles. The Portuguese who sailed into this ocean were not discovering it. They were arriving, uninvited, into a world that had been functioning without them for centuries. At the East African port of Malindi, after tense encounters at other ports where Arab merchants recognized the Portuguese immediately as commercial threats and worked to obstruct them, Gama found a navigator willing to guide the fleet across the Arabian Sea to India. The Portuguese sources call him Malemo Cana. His precise identity and background have been debated by historians without definitive resolution. What is not disputed is that he knew the monsoon routes that the Portuguese had no direct knowledge of, and under his guidance the fleet made the crossing from East Africa to the Malabar coast in roughly 23 days. On the 20th of May, 1498, the fleet anchored off Calicut. Stop here for a moment and consider what that means. A ship had sailed from the Tagus River in Lisbon, travelled south along the entire length of the African continent, rounded its southern tip into a different ocean, crossed that ocean, and arrived at one of the most important spice trading ports in Asia. The journey had taken 10.5 months. In surviving European records, it had never been done before. The commercial implications were not subtle. The Venetian and Arab monopoly on the spice trade, sustained for centuries by the simple geographical fact that there was no direct sea route from Atlantic Europe to Asia, bypassing the Mediterranean and its intermediaries, was broken in principle by the presence of 4 Portuguese ships in an Indian harbour. The first visit to Calicut did not produce a commercial agreement. The Zamorin, the ruler of Calicut, was unimpressed by the trade goods the Portuguese had brought, which were suited to African coastal trade rather than to a sophisticated Asian commercial port. The Arab merchants already operating in Calicut recognized the Portuguese as threats and worked actively to undermine the negotiations. Gama returned to Portugal without the trading relationship he had sought. But he returned. He had been there. The route was proven. The return voyage was brutal in ways the departure had not prepared them for, crossing the Arabian Sea against the monsoon, without the experienced pilot who had guided them east. It took 3 months instead of 23 days. Scurvy, the disease caused by vitamin C deficiency that would kill more sailors across the following 2 centuries of European oceanic expansion than any battle or storm, reached its worst phase during that crossing. Men who had survived the southern Atlantic and the Indian Ocean began dying of a disease no one yet understood. Roughly a third of the crew that had left Lisbon did not survive to return. Men died at sea and were buried in it. The São Rafael, Paulo da Gama's ship, was deliberately burned during the return. There were no longer enough living sailors to crew all 4 vessels. Paulo da Gama made it as far as the island of Terceira in the Azores before his illness overcame him. Vasco had him buried there, in the Church of the Holy Saviour, before continuing south to Lisbon. The chronicle does not record what passed between the 2 brothers in those final days. It records only the coordinates of the island and the name of the church, and the fact that the fleet continued without him. Some losses are too large for the documents to contain. Vasco da Gama entered Lisbon in September of 1499. The city came to the waterfront. King Manuel I understood immediately what the voyage meant. He adopted new titles. He commissioned the follow-up expedition, and he ordered the construction of a monastery, the Jeronimos Monastery at Belém, begun in 1502, was built on the site of the chapel where the crew had prayed before departure. It was funded by a tax on the spice trade the voyage had made possible. A percentage of the wealth flowing into Lisbon through the new Indian Ocean route was set aside. From the beginning, to build a monument, the building that rose on the Tagus waterfront over the following decades is one of the most extraordinary structures in Portugal. Its stonework incorporates maritime imagery, ropes and coral and armillary spheres, in a decorative style historians call manueline, after the king who commissioned it. Walking through its interior today, through vaulting that seems to grow from the floor like the ribs of an enormous living thing, is to stand inside the physical expression of a city that believed it had found the center of the world. The monastery was built on wealth from a trade enforced by violence. The Estado de India, the Portuguese commercial empire in Asia that developed in the first decades of the 16th century, operated through a system of required passes that Asian merchants had to purchase from the Portuguese to trade on routes that Portugal claimed to control by naval force. Ships without passes were treated as pirates. Cargoes were seized. Arab commercial networks that had sustained the Indian Ocean trade for centuries were disrupted by deliberate military pressure. This was not exploration in the romantic sense. This was empire, control enforced by warships, wealth extracted through coercion. The monastery is real. The violence that funded it is equally real. Both belong in the same sentence, in the same story. Told honestly, the city that sent Vasco da Gama south in July of 1497 was about to become something no one in it had fully prepared for. It was about to become the most globally connected city in the world. Chapter 6. Lisbon, the first city of the world. In the year 1500, roughly 12 months after Vasco da Gama returned from Calicut, a Portuguese fleet of 13 ships under the command of Pedro Alvares Cabral set sail from the Tagus with orders to establish a permanent trading relationship in India. On the way there, Cabral swung so far west into the Atlantic, following the understanding of South Atlantic wind patterns that the previous generation of Portuguese navigation had established, that he made landfall on a coast that had not previously appeared in surviving Portuguese or European records. He spent a few days observing, sent one ship back to Lisbon with news of the discovery, and continued south to India. The coast was Brazil. From the perspective of the Portuguese court in 1500, Brazil was an interesting geographical note attached to the margin of the main commercial objective. Within a generation, that judgment would be completely reversed, and Brazil would become the most commercially valuable territory Portugal controlled. But what matters here is the almost incidental character of the discovery. The way in which Portuguese maritime activity in the early 16th century was generating major geographical revelations, not as the purpose of specific expeditions, but as byproducts of voyages aimed at known destinations. This is what a generation of systematic investment looks like when it reaches critical mass. Things are found because ships are moving constantly in every direction with sufficient frequency that encountering the previously unrecorded becomes, over time, nearly inevitable. And all of it flowed through Lisbon. The city that existed at the mouth of the Tagus in the first half of the 16th century was unlike anything that had previously existed in Western Europe. The Ribeira waterfront, the stretch of dockside running along the northern bank of the Tagus below the old Moorish hill, was the commercial centre of a trading system connecting 4 continents simultaneously. Ships arrived from Goa carrying pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg. Ships arrived from the West African coast carrying gold dust, ivory, and enslaved people. Ships arrived from Brazil carrying red dyewood and, increasingly, sugar. Ships arrived from Madeira and the Azores carrying wine. Walk along the Rua Nova dos Mercadores, the main commercial street of 16th century Lisbon, on any morning in the 1520s or 1530s, and you would hear a dozen languages before you had walked 100 paces. Flemish merchants maintained permanent counting houses there. Italian bankers from Genoa and Florence provided the financial infrastructure, the letters of credit and currency exchange services that long-distance trade required. The Fugger banking family from Augsburg, the most powerful financial network in early 16th century Europe, established a presence in Lisbon because Lisbon was where the money was concentrating, and the Fuggers followed money the way water follows a slope. Jewish merchants who had been among the commercial and intellectual backbone of Portuguese life before the forced conversions of 1497, under King Manuel I, a decision that damaged Portuguese intellectual and commercial capacity for generations, continued to operate in various forms through the following decades. The population of Lisbon grew faster in the first half of the 16th century than that of almost any other city in Western Europe. Estimates by historians working on this period suggest the city expanded from somewhere around 65,000 or 70,000 people, near 1,500 to perhaps 100,000 or more by the middle of the century. The growth was driven by commercial activity. by the labour demands of the port, by the gravitational pull of wealth concentrating in one place. The people arriving in Lisbon during these decades came from an extraordinary range of origins. There were Italian pilots and cartographers whose expertise in navigation and geographical representation was commercially valuable to a kingdom needing the best available knowledge. There were craftsmen from across Portugal itself. There were enslaved Africans, whose numbers in Lisbon grew substantially across the 16th century. Research by historians of early modern Portugal suggests the enslaved African population of Lisbon in the mid-16th century may have represented roughly 10% of the city's total inhabitants, making it the largest concentration of African people in any European city of the period. They were concentrated in the labour of the docks, in domestic service in wealthy households, in the agricultural operations of the surrounding region. Their presence shaped the city in ways that the conventional narrative of the Age of Discovery tends to undercount, and that belong in a complete account. There were also people returning from the empire itself, sailors and soldiers and administrators back from Goa or Mozambique or Brazil, men who had seen things no European in the previous generation had seen, carrying that experience back into the streets of a city that was simultaneously the departure point for and the destination of the most extraordinary commercial enterprise the world had yet produced. What did walking through this city actually feel like? Stand at the Ribeira waterfront on a morning in 1530. The smell hits you first. Salt and fish and tar, and the warm sweetness of spices being unloaded from ships that had travelled 10,000 miles to bring them here. To your left, the Ribeira Palace, built directly on the waterfront so the king could watch his ships arriving. To your right, downstream, the Tower of Belém marking the ceremonial entrance to the river, completed in 1521. Behind you, up the hill, the castle of São Jorge, now a royal palace, governing an empire spanning 4 continents from a hill above a river in a kingdom of 1.5 million people. And at Belém, upstream, the Geronimo's monastery still under active construction throughout much of this period, its scaffolded exterior rising above the waterfront while inside. Craftsmen whose individual names we mostly do not know were carving the extraordinary stone vaulting that would outlast every other physical trace of the wealth that funded it. Few cities of Lisbon's size have ever done what this city did in this century. But the harder question, the one the people living inside it were not well positioned to ask in the middle of it, was whether the achievement was sustainable. The Dutch were watching. The English were watching. They were studying Portuguese navigational methods wherever they could obtain them. They were building ships. They were developing their own expertise in the routes that Portugal had opened. And at home, the wealth flowing through Lisbon was not being invested in the domestic agricultural and manufacturing development that would have built a broader economic base. The Portuguese economy was structurally dependent on trade revenue flowing through the capital's port. The steady outflow of men to Asia and Africa and Brazil was a demographic cost accumulating across the decades without an obvious mechanism for replenishment. A kingdom of 1.5 million people was attempting to maintain commercial dominance across 4 continents simultaneously. These vulnerabilities were not clearly visible from inside Lisbon in 1530, when the spice ships were arriving and the Geronimo's was rising. They would become visible later. For now, the city was the centre of something that had never existed before. A city whose ships had opened sea routes connecting Europe to Asia to Africa to the Americas in a single commercial system for the first time in recorded history. A city that had helped make the first truly global European maps possible. A city of 100,000 people on 7 hills above a river, at the centre of the world. It would not always look like this. Nothing ever does. But for this moment, in this city, in this century. It was real. Chapter 7. The Great Earthquake and the Man Who Rebuilt the World. Set your calendar to the 1st of November, 1755. It is All Saints' Day, one of the most important feast days in the Portuguese Catholic calendar. The churches of Lisbon are full. The population of the city, which has recovered and grown back to somewhere around 200,000 people after the commercial difficulties of the previous century, has turned out in its finest clothes for morning mass. Candles burn on every altar across the city. Outside, the November morning is clear and unusually mild, the kind of autumn day that makes winter feel far away. At approximately 9:30 in the morning, the earth moved. What happened beneath the Atlantic Ocean that morning? At a point roughly 200 kilometers southwest of Lisbon, where the African and Eurasian tectonic plates meet along a fault system that had been accumulating stress for a very long time, released energy that modern seismologists, working from the historical accounts and the geological record, estimate at a magnitude of somewhere between 8.5 and 9. That places it among the most powerful earthquakes in recorded European history, and by some measures among the most powerful anywhere in the world in the past 500 years. The shaking lasted somewhere between 3.5 and 6 minutes, according to the surviving accounts. 3.5 minutes. Think about what that means for a building. Long enough for walls to crack, to lean, to decide which direction they are going to fall. Long enough for people inside to understand that this is not stopping. Long enough for the ceiling of a cathedral built in the 12th century and expanded over 600 years of subsequent construction to make the final calculation and come down. The cathedral on the hill suffered massive structural damage. The royal palace on the waterfront was severely damaged. Across the Alfama and the denser commercial quarters of the lower city, buildings fell into the narrow streets and buried the people who had not yet made it outside. Then the fires started. The candles lit on every altar for All Saints' Day Mass, knocked from their positions by the shaking, ignited the decorations and the wooden furnishings of churches and chapels across the city simultaneously. The fires spread through neighborhoods where fallen buildings had created channels for the wind, and where the narrow lanes of the old Islamic street pattern provided ready pathways for flames to jump between structures. There was no organized firefighting capacity capable of containing what had started in dozens of locations at once. The fires burned through most of the day and into the night. Then, approximately 40 minutes after the initial earthquake, the sea withdrew. People who had survived the collapse and the fires, and who had made their way to the open space of the waterfront, watched the Tagus pull back from its banks in a way the river had never behaved before. Some of them walked down onto the exposed riverbed to look at the fish stranded there, and at the debris of old ships and anchors and centuries of harbour activity suddenly revealed beneath them. They were standing in the space where the warning would come from. They had no experience of what that withdrawal meant. The first wave arrived approximately 40 minutes after the earthquake. Researchers have estimated wave heights at between 6 and 20 meters across different sections of the Lisbon waterfront, a range reflecting both genuine variation in impact and the inherent difficulty of reconstructing physical measurements from historical testimony alone. 3 major waves struck in sequence. The people who had gathered on the open waterfront after the earthquake did not survive. The combined death toll from the earthquake, the fires, and the tsunami is estimated by historians at somewhere between 10,000 and 30,000 for Lisbon itself, with additional deaths along the Portuguese and Moroccan coasts where the tsunami also struck. Roughly 85% of the structures in Lisbon were destroyed or severely damaged. The Royal Library was gone. The archives of the India House, which held maps and logs and commercial records, accumulated across 2.5 centuries of oceanic trade, were gone. 12 of the city's 40 or so churches were destroyed. The Rua Nova dos Mercadores, where the wealth of 4 continents had been traded for 100 years, was rubble and ash. There is a detail in the written record that stays with you long after the numbers are forgotten. A Jesuit priest named Gabriel Malagrida, who had returned to Lisbon from Brazil and who would later be executed by the government on unrelated charges, walked through the ruins in the days after the earthquake and wrote a description of what he saw. He described bodies still in the positions they had fallen, people who had been kneeling in church when the ceiling came down, their hands still folded. He was writing to make a theological argument, that the earthquake was divine punishment for the sins of the city. But embedded in his theological polemic is a physical record of the first hours after the disaster that no other source preserves in the same detail. History keeps its receipts in unexpected places. What happened next is one of the most remarkable administrative responses to catastrophe in the history of any city. Sebastião José de Carvalho e Melo, known to history by the title awarded him later, the Marquis of Pombal, was the effective head of the Portuguese government under King José I. He was not a universally admired figure. He was ambitious, politically ruthless, willing to use state power against opponents in ways that later generations would find troubling. He was also, in the hours and days after the 1st of November, 1755, the person who most clearly understood what needed to happen and who had both the authority and the temperament to make it happen. The famous summary attributed to him, that he ordered those around him to bury the dead, tend to the living, and rebuild the city, may be a later compression of a more complex series of orders, rather than words he spoke in exactly that form. But as a description of his actual priorities in the days following the disaster, it is accurate. He organized the removal of bodies before disease could compound the death toll. He requisitioned food supplies and organized their distribution into a city where the normal commercial infrastructure had been physically destroyed. He imposed price controls on essential goods to prevent the profiteering that catastrophes reliably produce. He deployed military units to maintain order in a city where the normal structures of daily life had collapsed along with the buildings. He organized systematic surveys of what had survived and what had not, and within weeks of the earthquake, he had commissioned plans for the reconstruction of the lower city. The plan, developed primarily by military engineer Manuel de Maia and architect Eugenio dos Santos, was not a restoration of what had been destroyed. It was a redesign. The Baija, the lower commercial quarter most completely obliterated, was to be rebuilt on a rational grid of wide, straight streets intersecting at right angles, with standardized building heights and construction methods specifically intended to reduce damage from future earthquakes. The buildings would use a timber frame technique, later called the gaiola or cage system, designed to flex rather than collapse under seismic stress. To test the earthquake resistance of the proposed construction, according to accounts verified from contemporary records, troops were ordered to march in formation around prototype structures to simulate the vibrations of seismic activity. This was either charmingly naive in its methodology or surprisingly empirical in its approach, or possibly both simultaneously. It was, in any case, an attempt to apply rational testing to a structural engineering problem rather than simply rebuilding what had stood before. The Baixa Pombalina that exists today is Pombal's city. Walk from the waterfront at Praça do Comércio north through the grid toward Rocio Square, and you are walking through one of the earliest examples of systematic urban planning in the modern European sense. A significant portion of a major city redesigned according to principles derived from reason and applied simultaneously across an entire district. The streets are wide, the buildings are regular. The whole district has a coherence that comes from having been planned as a unit rather than accumulated across centuries. The earthquake destroyed a city. The response to it created something that, in a strange and painful way, was more deliberately conceived than what the earthquake had taken. Pombal used the crisis for other purposes as well. He moved against the Jesuits, expelling the entire order from Portugal and its colonies in 1759. 14 years before Pope Clement XIV dissolved the order across the Catholic world entirely. He moved against aristocratic families who had opposed his policies. He used the emergency authority the crisis had provided to concentrate power in ways that outlasted the emergency. When King Jose I died in 1777 and his daughter Maria I took the throne, Pombal had accumulated enough enemies that his removal from power was the first act of the new reign. He was stripped of his offices, prosecuted, and sentenced to a form of house arrest on his estate north of Lisbon. He died in 1782. The city he rebuilt survived him. It survives today. The Baixa Pombalina is now a protected historic district. Tourists walk its rational grid without necessarily knowing they are walking through the world's first large-scale earthquake-resistant urban planning project, built on the ruins of a catastrophe that killed tens of thousands of people on the morning of All Saints' Day in 1755. But the larger story of Portugal in the decades after 1755 is not a story of recovery and renewed greatness. It is the story of a country trying to hold its position in a world that had been moving on from the moment of Portuguese centrality for a century. A world where the Dutch and the English had built their own maritime empires using the knowledge and the routes that Portugal had opened, and where the small Atlantic kingdom was increasingly peripheral to the economic and political forces reshaping everything. That story, the long, difficult arc from the ruins of 1755 to the revolution that would finally crack open the 20th century, is the next chapter of what Lisbon became. Chapter 8. The King Who Sailed Away. On the 27th of November, 1807, as a French army was approaching the outskirts of Lisbon, the Portuguese royal court boarded ships in the Tagus and departed, not as refugees fleeing a city under immediate attack. As a deliberate strategic calculation, the state would go to its most valuable remaining territory, Brazil, and govern from there until the situation in Europe resolved. The fleet was substantial, somewhere between 25 and 35 vessels by various accounts, carrying not just the royal family but the apparatus of the Portuguese state, government records, the contents of the royal treasury, the royal library, or what could be loaded in the time available. Somewhere between 10,000 and 15,000 people in total. British warships escorted them out of the river. The population of Lisbon lined the waterfront to watch. Think about what that sight meant to the people standing there. The spice fleets had left from this waterfront. The ships that had drawn the first map of the African coast had left from this waterfront. Vasco da Gama had left from this waterfront. Now the king was leaving, and unlike every fleet that had left before, this one was not going out to find something and bring it back. It was going because the alternative was capture. The French general Jean Andoche Junot arrived 2 days later to find a capital without a government. He occupied it anyway. What followed was 3 French invasions of Portugal over the next several years, and 3 British and Portuguese campaigns to expel them. The conflict known in British history as the Peninsular War. The Duke of Wellington, commanding the Allied forces through much of the campaign, built the defensive lines of Torres Vedras north of Lisbon, a massive system of fortifications that made the capital militarily impregnable By 1811, the French were gone. The country was exhausted and economically damaged by years of war, and the king was still in Brazil. João VI remained in Rio de Janeiro for 14 years after the French departure. He governed Portugal through intermediaries. The resentment this produced accumulated steadily. In 1820, a liberal revolution in Porto demanded a constitution and demanded that the king return. João VI came back in 1821 and accepted a constitutional settlement, significantly reducing royal power. The following year, Brazil declared independence. The declaration was delivered by João's own son Pedro, whom the king had left behind as regent. Pedro had developed both political skill and genuine attachment to Brazil during the years of the court's residence there. He recognized that the independence movement had reached a point where leading it was more advantageous than opposing it. On the 7th of September, 1822, on the banks of the Ipiranga stream in the province of São Paulo, Pedro declared Brazil an independent empire, with himself as emperor. Portugal had lost its most valuable colony, the country that had sent ships to India and Brazil and China and Japan, that had helped make the first truly global European maps possible, that had held for one extraordinary century a commercial position at the center of the world, was now a constitutional monarchy of roughly 3 million people on the western edge of Europe, stripped of the colonial revenue that had sustained its imperial ambitions for 3 centuries. The political life of Portugal across the following decades was turbulent in ways that made sustained economic development difficult. A civil war between liberal and absolutist factions consumed the country from 1828 to 1834. The liberals won. A constitutional monarchy was established that would, with modifications, survive until 1910. The second half of the 19th century brought a degree of stability and modest development. The railway reached Lisbon in 1856. The famous electric trams began service in 1873. The physical fabric of the city expanded and modernized. The population grew, and in a quiet apartment in the Chiado district, overlooking streets that had been rebuilt after the earthquake and widened after Pombal, and were now filling with the particular melancholy energy of a city that knows it was once something larger, a young man named Fernando Pessoa was growing up. Pessoa was born in Lisbon in 1888 and died there in 1935. He spent most of his life in the city, working as a commercial translator, writing in multiple languages, and producing under a series of fictional personas he called heteronyms, a body of poetry and prose now considered among the most significant in 20th century European literature. His most celebrated work, The Book of Disquiet, a fragmentary meditation on Lisbon and memory and the experience of inhabiting a life, was not published in his lifetime. It was assembled from manuscript fragments found in a trunk after his death. Pessoa matters to the story of this city not because his literary achievement can be reduced to his location, but because his work gives precise expression to something in the emotional atmosphere of the place in his era. The Portuguese call it saudade, a word that resists full translation into English. A longing for something absent, something lost or perhaps never quite possessed, simultaneously painful and cherished. Pessoa's Lisbon is a city that knows it was once the center of the world and is living, quietly and without resolution, in the long aftermath of that knowledge. The 20th century would test that inheritance more severely than even Pessoa, who died before its worst was over, could fully anticipate. Chapter 9. 40 Years of Silence. On a morning in April of 1974, a radio station in Lisbon broadcast a song. The song was a ballad called Grandola Vila Morena, written by a musician named José Afonso. It had been banned by the government censors because its lyrics, about a town governed by its people and by brotherhood, were considered politically dangerous. Its broadcast in the early hours of the 25th of April was a signal, agreed in advance among the officers of the armed forces movement, that the operation to overthrow the Portuguese government was proceeding as planned. By morning, military units controlled the key installations of the Portuguese state. By afternoon, crowds had gathered in the streets of Lisbon, and in one of those gestures that history produces rarely and that become symbolic precisely because they were not planned as symbols, people began placing carnations into the barrels of soldiers' rifles. The soldiers did not object. Some placed the flowers there themselves. The Carnation Revolution was almost bloodless. 4 people were killed, shot by agents of the Pied political police in one incident near Pied headquarters. By the standards of political upheavals of the 20th century, it was extraordinarily restrained. A regime that had governed Portugal for nearly 50 years fell in a single day with almost no organized resistance. To understand how that was possible, you need to go back to the beginning of the regime, and to the man who had built it. Antonio de Oliveira Salazar was born in 1889 in a small village in central Portugal. The son of a farm manager, he was a deeply Catholic, deeply conservative man whose economic training at the University of Coimbra had given him strong views about fiscal discipline and whose temperament inclined fundamentally toward order, stability, and the avoidance of what he regarded as the dangerous enthusiasms of modern politics, including democracy. He became Minister of Finance in 1928, insisting as a condition of accepting the post that he would have veto power over every other ministry's spending. Within 4 years he had extended his authority far beyond finance. By 1932 he was Prime Minister. By the mid-1930s he had constructed the Estado Novo, the new state. Salazar himself lived simply. He did not accumulate personal wealth. He did not build a theatrical personality cult. He governed through bureaucratic control, through the PIDE political police that monitored and suppressed dissent, through press censorship, and through the projection of a particular image of austere Catholic order that he appears to have genuinely believed in. There is a detail in the records of his government that captures something essential about the man and the system he created. In the 1940s and 1950s, the PIDE maintained files on a significant portion of the Portuguese population. Neighbours reported on neighbours. Schoolteachers reported on students. The files themselves were not primarily records of dramatic subversion. They were records of ordinary people who had said the wrong thing at the wrong time in the wrong room. A worker who had complained about wages. A student who had attended an unauthorized meeting. A professor who had assigned a book the censors had not approved. The machinery of the Estado Novo was powered not by spectacular repression but by the slow, grinding, pervasive pressure of a system that made caution the only rational survival strategy. That is what 40 years of silence actually meant. Not the absence of thought, the presence of fear. Salazar's economic policy was, by mid-20th century European standards, deliberately conservative. He was suspicious of rapid industrialization, suspicious of foreign investment, suspicious of the social disruption that economic modernization reliably produces. The Estado Novo Portugal of the 1930s and 40s was a predominantly rural, agricultural country in which the pace of economic change was kept slow as a matter of deliberate policy. By the mid-1950s, when Western European economies were expanding rapidly under the stimulus of post-war reconstruction, Portugal remained the poorest country in Western Europe by most standard economic measures. Young Portuguese were leaving for France, for Germany, for anywhere that offered wages the domestic economy could not provide. Portugal did participate in the European Recovery Programme, receiving Marshall Plan assistance. But Salazar used that assistance within a framework that prioritized fiscal stability and the maintenance of the existing social order over the rapid industrialization and democratization that the program supported in France, West Germany, and Italy. The result was a country that received the assistance and remained poor while its neighbors rebuilt into prosperity. The deepest contradiction of Salazar's long rule was the colonial question. Portugal in 1945 still governed Angola and Mozambique in Africa, Goa on the Indian subcontinent, Timor in Southeast Asia, and several smaller territories. These were, in Salazar's formulation, not colonies, but integral parts of a pluricontinental nation, as Portuguese as Lisbon itself. He explicitly and consistently rejected the decolonization that Britain, et France, and the Netherlands were undertaking across the 1950s and early 1960s. In 1961, armed independence movements began in Angola. Similar movements developed in Mozambique and Guinea-Bissau in the following years. Portugal responded by deploying troops to fight counterinsurgency wars on 3 fronts simultaneously, wars that continued for 13 years, consuming a steadily growing share of the national budget, and that sent a generation of young Portuguese men to fight in African territories for a colonial system that most of the world had already concluded was both indefensible and unsustainable. Salazar himself did not see the end. He suffered a stroke in 1968 after falling from a chair, and the Estado Novo government, unwilling to formally acknowledge that the man who had run everything for nearly 4 decades was incapacitated, conducted the extraordinary exercise of continuing to brief him on state affairs while his successor, Marcelo Caetano, actually governed. Salazar received officials. He gave instructions. He believed he was still in charge. He was not. He died in 1970, unaware that the country had already moved on without him. There is something in that ending that feels like a parable about the regime itself, a system so committed to the appearance of continuity that it maintained the fiction of a man's authority even after the man was gone. Caetano attempted limited liberalization without delivering substantive change. The colonial wars continued, the military, bearing the cost most directly, was losing patience at a rate Caetano did not fully appreciate. The armed forces movement that executed the coup of the 25th of April 1974 was composed primarily of mid-ranking officers, captains and majors, men who had served multiple tours in Africa. They were not radical ideologues. They were professional military men who had been asked to spend their careers fighting colonial wars for a regime they had concluded was both unjust and strategically bankrupt. Caetano surrendered to the coup leaders at the Carmo barracks in central Lisbon before the day was over. What followed was turbulent and uncertain in ways the clean, retrospective narrative of democratic transition tends to smooth over. There were political conflicts between factions ranging from Marxist left to conservative right. There were attempted countercoups. For roughly 18 months after the revolution, the direction of the Portuguese state was genuinely uncertain. The outcome that now seems inevitable, a stable parliamentary democracy integrated into Western European institutions, was not obvious to the people living through it. Decolonization happened fast. Guinea-Bissau became independent in 1974, Mozambique, Angola, and the other African territories in 1975. For Portugal, Decolonization produced a rapid influx of retornados, Portuguese citizens from the African territories who now returned, roughly 500,000 people arriving in a country of 9 million within a few years, a demographic shock that created real social stress and also brought skills and energy that contributed to the development of the following decades. And Goa. India had annexed Goa by military operation in 1961, an action Salazar had refused to recognize as legitimate, and that the Estado Novo had formally protested for the 13 remaining years of its existence. With the revolution, Portugal recognized Indian sovereignty, the last territorial remnant of the empire that Vasco da Gama's voyage had set in motion. The Indian possession that had been the original commercial prize of the Age of Exploration was formally relinquished 576 years after 4 ships had left this river to find it. Portugal held its first free elections in 1975. A constitution was adopted in 1976. The city that had once sent ships in every direction was about to be rediscovered by the world it had helped map. Chapter 10. Europe, Recovery, and the Return of the World. On the 1st of January, 1986, Portugal formally joined the European Economic Community. That date is among the most consequential in modern Portuguese history. The accession had required 9 years of negotiation, delayed by concerns among existing members about whether a country that had only recently emerged from nearly 5 decades of authoritarian rule was structurally ready for the obligations and the competition that membership implied. When Portugal finally joined, it was among the poorest countries entering a community designed in significant part to close exactly that kind of gap. The structural funds that began flowing from Brussels after 1986 were substantial. Roads were built that had not previously existed. Universities were expanded. Infrastructure neglected through the Salazar decades and the turbulent transition years was finally modernized. The Portuguese economy grew consistently through the late 1980s and into the 1990s at rates that reflected the scale of the catch-up taking place. But the change that mattered most in Lisbon was not measured in road kilometres or university enrolment figures. It was measured in what happened to ordinary people on ordinary streets. A woman who had grown up in the Alfama in the 1960s, in a neighbourhood without reliable hot water and with a school that had not updated its textbooks since the Estado Novo had approved them, watched her daughter enroll in a university that now offered courses in Portuguese and English and had exchange programs with universities in France and Germany and Spain. A man who had spent his 20s in France working construction because there was no comparable work in Lisbon found that by the mid-1990s there was work in Lisbon. Good work. Enough to come home for. These were not headline events. They were the actual substance of what European integration meant for the people it touched. Lisbon changed visibly during this period. The Expo 98, the World's Fair that Portugal hosted on a stretch of former industrial wasteland along the Tagus, was the most deliberate expression of that transformation. The site had been, until the late 1980s, among the most neglected urban areas in the city, a contaminated stretch of riverbank containing refineries and slaughterhouses and the accumulated industrial debris of a century of neglect. Its conversion into a World's Fair organized around the theme of the oceans. On the 500th anniversary of Vasco da Gama's voyage to India, was both practical urban renewal and a statement about what Portugal was choosing to say about itself. After the expo closed, the site became the Parque das Nações, a new urban district, now home to tens of thousands of residents and representing the most significant addition to the city's urban fabric in the modern era. More than 11 million visitors attended the fair in its 3-month run. For a city of roughly 560,000 people within its administrative boundaries, it was a moment of international visibility that Lisbon had not experienced since the 16th century. Portugal adopted the euro in 2002. The shared currency brought price stability and eliminated the currency risk that had complicated foreign investment. It also brought constraints that a country without its own monetary policy would find extremely difficult to manage when the global financial system entered crisis. The financial crisis of 2008 hit Portugal with particular severity. The economy had accumulated significant debt during the euro years, borrowing at interest rates that the shared currency had made low, and that reflected the assumption, built into the original architecture of the eurozone, that membership effectively guaranteed the creditworthiness of all participating governments. When that assumption broke down across southern Europe after 2008, the consequences were severe. By 2011, Portugal required an international bailout from the European Union, the European Central Bank, and the International Monetary Fund. The conditions required cuts to public spending and increases in taxation that reduced living standards significantly. Unemployment peaked at above 17% in 2013, according to Eurostat data from that period. Youth unemployment reached levels that sent a generation of young Portuguese abroad in search of work that the contracted domestic economy could not provide. The best educated generation in the country's history was leaving. Lisbon, during the austerity years, had the quality of a city that knows it has more to offer than its current circumstances allow. The architecture was magnificent and in places deteriorating. Beautiful azulejo tile facades peeling and cracking in neighbourhoods that lacked resources for maintenance. The food was extraordinary and inexpensive by Western European standards because the local economy could not sustain the prices that comparable quality commanded in London or Paris. The people were educated, multilingual, and oriented toward a wider world than Portugal alone. Those qualities, which the austerity years had rendered visible by stripping away the surface prosperity of the euro boom, turned out to be exactly what a certain kind of international visitor and investor was about to come looking for. Chapter 11. The Most Desired City and the Price of Being Found. Sometime around 2013 or 2014, something shifted in the way the world was paying attention to Lisbon. The forces that produced what followed were multiple and reinforcing in ways that made the combination more powerful than any single element alone. Low prices relative to other Western European capitals made the city accessible to visitors and investors from countries where comparable quality cost dramatically more. A favorable climate, with mild winters, long, warm summers, and a quality of Atlantic light that photographers and painters found genuinely distinctive, made Lisbon appealing in ways that northern European cities could not replicate regardless of their other attractions. A food culture drawing on the extraordinary seafood of the Atlantic coast, the olive oil and wine of the interior, and the spice influences that centuries of global trade had layered into the national culinary tradition, was producing a restaurant scene of real quality at prices that felt almost implausibly low to visitors from London or New York. And the city was visually extraordinary in a way that the smartphone camera and the social media platform made distributable to a global audience at unprecedented scale and speed. The yellow trams climbing the hills of the Alfama, the azulejo tile facades that had survived the earthquake and the centuries since, the views from the Miradouros, the hilltop overlook points, across the terracotta rooftops to the wide silver Tagus and the Atlantic light beyond. These images circulated. People who had never specifically thought about Lisbon encountered them and felt the pull. Short-term rental platforms connected global demand for Lisbon with the supply of apartments in the older neighbourhoods whose residents were, in many cases, living in rent-controlled accommodations that had not kept pace with rising market value of their locations. Landlords who discovered that a Lisbon apartment could generate more revenue in a month of tourist rentals than in several months of long-term local tenancy had a financial incentive that was straightforward, and the legal framework of the period did not meaningfully constrain it. There is a woman in this story whose name does not appear in any policy document or economic report, but who is the actual subject of what was happening. She had lived in the Alfama her entire life. Her grandmother had lived in the same building. The narrow street outside her window was the street she had walked to school on, the street where she had bought bread every morning for 40 years, the street where she knew which neighbour kept late hours and which kept early ones by the sound of their footsteps on the stairs. Then the building was sold. The new owner converted every apartment to short-term tourist rentals. She was offered a settlement and a deadline. She moved to a suburb on the south bank of the Tagus. The commute took 40 minutes each way. The bread in the new neighbourhood was different. This story happened many times, not always in exactly that form, but in variations close enough to it that the people who lived it would recognize the shape. The result was a displacement process that operated through market mechanisms rather than through explicit policy, and that was precisely because of its market character more difficult to address through the normal instruments of political response. Residents of the Alfama and the Moreria and the Bairro Alto, neighbourhoods that had been working-class communities for generations, found their neighbours leaving and their local commerce changing to serve visitors rather than inhabitants. The butcher and the hardware store and the neighbourhood cafe were replaced by establishments oriented toward people passing through. A non-habitual resident tax regime, introduced in 2009 and expanded in subsequent years, offered substantial tax advantages to foreign nationals establishing fiscal residence in Portugal, effectively providing a subsidy, funded in part by ordinary Portuguese taxpayers, for the relocation of high-income foreigners to a country where their purchasing power was, by local standards, very large. A golden visa program, introduced in 2012, offered residency rights to non-European investors placing qualifying investments in Portuguese real estate or businesses. Both programs attracted the international residents they were designed to attract. Both contributed to the pressure on housing prices that made Lisbon progressively less accessible to the people who had been living there before the city became desirable. The technology industry arrived. Lisbon began hosting the Web Summit, one of the largest technology conferences in the world, from 2016 onward, when the event relocated from Dublin. The conference reflected and amplified Lisbon's reputation as a hospitable environment for technology businesses, built on relatively low operating costs, a well-educated workforce, favorable climate, and a quality of life that founders and employees found genuinely attractive. The pandemic of 2020 was a rupture in this trajectory. The tourist economy essentially stopped. The streets of the Alfama, thick with visitors in 2019, were quiet in a way that residents who remained had not experienced in years. Short-term rental apartments went dark. The economic model that had been reshaping the city paused. Portugal managed the public health dimensions of the crisis with organizational effectiveness that received considerable international recognition. The vaccination campaign of 2021 was among the fastest and most comprehensive rollouts in Europe by most measures. When the pandemic receded and the world began to travel and relocate again, Lisbon returned to the center of attention it had occupied before the disruption. With the pressures intensified, the years of restricted movement had increased appetite for travel and relocation. The expansion of remote work had permanently increased the number of people who could choose where to live without being tied to a specific office. Lisbon's advantages had not diminished during the interruption. Housing prices in central Lisbon by the mid-2020s had risen to levels that would have seemed extraordinary a decade earlier. According to data published by Eurostat and the Portuguese National Statistics Institute in recent years, residential property prices in Lisbon rose by more than 100% in the decade following the end of the austerity period, placing it among the fastest appreciating housing markets in Europe in that period. Young people who grew up in the city found themselves competing in a market being set by buyers and renters with access to purchasing power that the local economy could not match. The city government introduced measures intended to address the housing crisis, including restrictions on new short-term rental licenses in the most affected neighborhoods. The national government ended the Golden Visa program for real estate investment in 2023. Whether these measures arrived in time to meaningfully protect the residential character of the historic neighborhoods remained, as of 2026, a question the evidence had not yet fully answered. There is a tension at the heart of contemporary Lisbon that is real and is not resolving quickly. The city is genuinely beautiful. Its history is genuinely extraordinary. The food, the light, the tiles, the trams, the views from the hilltops, the quality of the Atlantic air on a clear morning above the Tagus. All of it exists, and none of it is manufactured for tourism. The people who fall in love with Lisbon when they visit are responding to something real that has been built and rebuilt and built again across 3,000 years of human presence on these 7 hills. The problem is not that the city is loved. The problem is that love at scale, love expressed through the mechanisms of a globalized economy in which some participants have vastly more purchasing power than others, can hollow out the thing it is drawn to, the authentic Lisbon that visitors are seeking, the neighborhood social life, the working communities, the particular human texture of a place continuously inhabited and continuously transformed for 3 millennia, is precisely what is most at risk from the economic forces that the city's attractiveness has set in motion. Lisbon has been here before, not in this specific form, but in the experience of being at the center of global attention and global commercial flows, of being the place where the wealth and the people and the ambitions are concentrating, and of discovering that centrality is complicated, and that the wealth it brings does not distribute itself in ways that benefit everyone equally. The 16th century spice trade made this city the most globally connected place in the world, and filled its warehouses with wealth, and filled its neighborhoods with enslaved people, and sent its sons to die in Asian harbors. The 21st century attention economy is making Lisbon one of the most desired cities in the world, and filling its oldest neighborhoods with short-term rental apartments, and making it difficult for the people who give those neighborhoods their character to afford to stay in them. The mechanisms are different. The underlying pattern is not. Lisbon has been navigating some version of this longer than most cities have existed. Stand at the edge of the Tagus on any morning and look west. The water is still wide. The Atlantic is still 20 miles beyond the bar at the river's mouth. The light falls across the water the same way it always has, flat and silver in the early hours, warming toward gold as the morning develops, catching the white facades of the buildings on the hills and throwing them back bright enough to make you squint. The ships that leave this river today are container vessels and ferries and the commuter boats crossing to the south bank, carrying the people who have found that housing on the far side of the Tagus is more affordable than anything on the 7 hills. They are not caravels. They carry no spices. Nobody standing on their decks is about to return with the outline of a continent previously uncharted in European records. but the river is the same river, and the impulse that puts ships on it, the desire to go further, to find out what lies beyond the next headland, to connect this particular place to the wider world and bring the wider world back to this particular place. That impulse is older than any of the people who acted on it. It is as old as the first person who stood on this hill, looked west at the water, and decided that the distance between here and the horizon was not a barrier. It was an invitation. Every time you track a package moving across the ocean, every time you grind pepper into your food or pour coffee from beans grown on a continent thousands of miles away, every time you look at a world map and recognize its familiar outlines, the shape that has seemed obvious your entire life, the shape that changed the way European maps represented the world permanently and completely. You are looking at the accumulated consequences of decisions made on this river, in this city, by people who mostly did not know they were changing anything and were simply trying to solve the problem in front of them. You did not know that when you woke up this morning. Most people do not. The history that shapes the daily texture of our lives is mostly invisible, buried under the weight of the present. That is why this story matters. Not as a celebration of empire, which caused immeasurable harm to millions of people across 4 continents and whose consequences are not finished. Not as nostalgia for a moment of Portuguese centrality that is gone and will not return in the same form, but as an honest account of how one city, small and peripheral and pressed into the western edge of a continent, looked at an ocean that everyone else had treated as the end of the world and decided it was the beginning of one. The road those ships opened is still there. The ocean has not changed. The river still runs to it. The same river that carried Phoenician traders and Roman amphorae and Moorish dhows and the spice caravels and the royal fleet escaping Napoleon and the ferries crossing to the south bank on a Tuesday morning in 2026. Right now, somewhere in this city, someone is sitting at a Miradoro as the evening light changes on the Tagus. Maybe they grew up here and are not sure they can afford to stay. Maybe they arrived from somewhere far away and are seeing this river for the first time and feeling something they do not yet have words for. Maybe they left years ago and came back and are sitting here trying to understand what the city has become and what it still is underneath everything it has become. They are all standing in the same place, the same hill, the same river, the same light. The story is not over. In a place that has been alive for 3,000 years, and that has been more than once the centre of the world. It never is. The Tagus keeps moving. We will see you in the past.